Fear was their language, violence was their signature, and conquest was not just a goal, but an identity. Cities surrendered at the mere mention of their name. Kings carved their victories into stone so the world would never forget who ruled and who was meant to obey. But how did a civilization rise from the harsh plains of Mesopotamia to become the first true military superpower in human history? Why did terror become a deliberate strategy of rule, and how did this empire, built on absolute dominance, eventually collapse under the very system it created? In this video, I'm going to discuss all of this: how it began, what happened, and how it changed the world. So without any delay, let's start. Long before Rome built its legions or Persia organized its satrapies, the Assyrians were already mastering war as a science. Their homeland lay in northern Mesopotamia, a region defined by open plains, limited natural defenses, and constant exposure to rival peoples. Unlike river-protected civilizations such as Egypt, Assyria had no natural barriers to shield it from invasion. Survival depended on strength, speed, and the ability to strike first. Over centuries, this reality shaped a society that viewed war not as an occasional necessity, but as a permanent condition of existence. At the heart of Assyrian identity was the belief that their gods demanded expansion. War was not merely political, it was divine duty. The god Ashur, both a deity and a symbol of the state itself, represented order imposed upon chaos. To resist Assyria was not just rebellion against a king, but defiance of cosmic order. This belief gave Assyrian rulers a powerful justification for endless conquest, allowing them to frame brutality as righteousness and destruction as sacred work. Early Assyrian kings began as regional players, defending trade routes and raiding nearby settlements, but over time something changed. Warfare became institutionalized. Armies were no longer temporary levies raised in times of crisis. They became standing forces, trained, equipped, and commanded year-round. Soldiers were organized into specialized units: infantry, archers, charioteers, and later cavalry, each with a defined role on the battlefield. This level of organization was unprecedented for its time. Technology gave the Assyrians another crucial advantage. They were among the first to master iron weapons on a large scale. Iron swords, spears, and armor outmatched the bronze equipment of their enemies, cutting through shields and bodies alike. Siege technology also evolved rapidly. Battering rams, mobile siege towers, and coordinated assault tactics allowed Assyrian armies to breach even heavily fortified cities. Walls, once symbols of security, became temporary obstacles against Assyrian engineering. But military power alone does not explain the terror the Assyrians inspired. Fear was deliberately cultivated. Assyrian kings understood psychology as well as strategy. When a city resisted, punishment was not only severe, but public. Executions were carried out in the open. Prisoners were flayed, impaled, or mutilated, their bodies displayed as warnings. Entire populations were deported, scattered across the empire to break resistance and erase identity. These acts were not hidden crimes, they were recorded proudly in royal inscriptions. Stone reliefs carved into palace walls depicted scenes of conquest in disturbing detail. Enemies begged for mercy, bodies piled high beneath city walls. Kings stood calm and composed amid the suffering. These images were not just art, they were propaganda. Anyone who entered an Assyrian city, especially the capital, was meant to understand one message clearly: resistance was pointless. This strategy worked with terrifying efficiency. Many cities surrendered without a fight, choosing submission over annihilation. Tribute flowed into Assyria: gold, silver, livestock, slaves, and luxury goods. Empire fueled wealth, and wealth fueled further conquest. The empire expanded across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and parts of Anatolia, becoming the dominant power of the Near East. Yet beneath this image of unstoppable force lay a complex system of control. The Assyrians did not rule purely through destruction. They built roads, standardized administration, and developed an intelligence network that monitored provinces and reported unrest. Governors were appointed directly by the king, and loyalty was enforced through constant surveillance and brutal consequences for failure. The empire functioned like a machine, driven by fear but sustained by organization. Assyrian kings were not distant figures. They personally led campaigns, presenting themselves as warrior rulers chosen by the gods. Military success was the foundation of legitimacy. A king who failed to conquer risked being seen as weak, both by his subjects and the divine order he claimed to serve. This created a dangerous cycle. Expansion was not optional, it was essential. Peace was not stability, it was stagnation. As the empire grew, so did its enemies. Subject peoples resented deportation, taxation, and cultural erasure. Revolts were frequent, and each rebellion required swift, overwhelming force to suppress. The Assyrian response was always the same: escalate terror to reassert control. Over time, violence became both the solution and the problem. Every act of brutality secured obedience in the short term, but planted hatred that would resurface later. By the height of Assyrian power, the empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. It dominated trade, dictated politics, and shaped the balance of power across the ancient world. No rival state could match its military efficiency. No city could feel entirely safe. Assyria had achieved something unprecedented, a centralized empire maintained primarily through military dominance and psychological control. But this system came with an inherent flaw. Fear is effective, but it is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement. The moment the threat weakens, suppressed resentment explodes. As Assyria expanded, it stretched its resources thin. Armies were constantly on campaign, supply lines grew longer, communication slowed. The empire became dependent on the very violence that sustained it, unable to pause without risking collapse. At the same time, new powers were rising on Assyria's borders, learning from its methods, adopting its technologies, and waiting for an opportunity. The empire that had taught the world how to wage total war was about to face the consequences of ruling entirely by fear. And what followed would prove that even the most terrifying power in history is not immune to exhaustion, rebellion, and the slow unraveling of control. As the Assyrian Empire entered its height, war became not just a tool of expansion, but the very rhythm of state survival. Each campaign followed a familiar pattern: rapid mobilization, overwhelming force, and an unmistakable message delivered before the first arrow was fired. Envoys were sent ahead of the army, carrying demands for submission. These were not negotiations, they were ultimatums. Submit, pay tribute, accept Assyrian authority, and live. Resist, and your city would cease to exist. When resistance came, the Assyrian army moved with terrifying coordination. Infantry advanced in disciplined formations, shields locked, absorbing missile fire. Archers followed, raining arrows to break defenders' ranks. Siege engineers constructed ramps and towers under cover of suppressing fire, pushing ever closer to city walls. Once breached, there was no chaos. The slaughter was systematic. Leaders were executed first, often in ritualized ways meant to erase the possibility of future rebellion. The population was then sorted, some killed, some enslaved, others deported to distant provinces. Deportation was one of Assyria's most effective and cruel innovations. Entire communities were uprooted and relocated hundreds of miles away, resettled among foreign populations. This served multiple purposes. It broke local identities, prevented organized resistance, and supplied labor to underdeveloped regions of the empire. Unlike later empires that relied on assimilation or local autonomy, Assyria preferred dislocation. A people without roots were easier to control. These practices created a strange paradox. The empire was extraordinarily stable at its core, yet perpetually unstable at its edges. Revolts were not rare events, they were expected. Assyrian administration assumed disobedience as a natural condition and planned accordingly. Garrisons were stationed in key cities. Intelligence networks monitored governors, priests, and local elites. Reports flowed constantly back to the king, detailing potential threats and loyalty levels. The Assyrian king stood at the center of this system like the axle of a wheel. His authority was absolute, reinforced by religion, tradition, and violence. Royal inscriptions described him not as a ruler among men, but as an agent of divine will. Victory was proof of favor from the gods. Defeat was almost unthinkable. This belief system placed enormous pressure on the monarchy. Every reign had to produce conquests. A peaceful king was a dangerous king, one who risked divine displeasure and internal unrest. This pressure drove the empire into near-constant warfare. Campaign seasons were annual. Even minor rebellions required full military responses because leniency was seen as weakness. Over time, the Assyrian army became increasingly professional but also increasingly exhausted. Soldiers were expected to march long distances, fight multiple sieges, and return only briefly before the next campaign began. War was no longer episodic, it was industrial in nature, consuming manpower year after year. Yet the empire continued to expand, reaching its peak under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal. Each ruler refined the machinery of terror and administration. Provinces were reorganized for efficiency. Taxation systems became more standardized. Roads and supply depots were built to support rapid troop movement. In many ways, Assyria invented the logistical backbone of empire. But conquest also created new vulnerabilities. As Assyria absorbed more territory, it absorbed more enemies. Former rivals became subjects, but their resentment did not disappear, it merely went underground. Rebellions were often coordinated, erupting simultaneously in multiple regions. Suppressing them required massive deployments, stretching the army thin and forcing difficult choices about where to apply force first. At the same time, the cultural consequences of Assyrian rule deepened hostility. The empire showed little interest in integrating subject peoples culturally or politically. Local traditions were tolerated only insofar as they did not challenge authority. Elites were replaced or co-opted, temples were looted, sacred symbols were carried off to Assyria as trophies. These acts struck at the spiritual heart of conquered societies, ensuring that resistance was not only political but deeply emotional. Ironically, the very propaganda that spread fear preserved Assyria's enemies. The detailed records of brutality carved into palace walls ensured that hatred would endure long after the events themselves. Assyria wanted to be remembered as unstoppable. It succeeded, but remembrance is not the same as loyalty. The empire's wealth reached astonishing levels. Tribute poured into capitals like Nineveh and Kalhu. Palaces were adorned with gold, ivory, and elaborate reliefs. Libraries were established, most famously under Ashurbanipal, who collected texts from across the known world. This intellectual ambition reveals a lesser-known side of Assyria, one that valued knowledge, history, and order. Yet even this cultural achievement was inseparable from conquest. Knowledge was collected as spoils, not shared as exchange. Beneath the grandeur, cracks were forming. Succession crises plagued the monarchy. Rival princes fought for the throne, often drawing provinces into civil conflict. Each internal struggle weakened central authority and encouraged rebellion at the edges. While the empire had been built to dominate external enemies, it was poorly equipped to manage prolonged internal fragmentation. Environmental factors also played a role. Maintaining large armies and monumental cities placed heavy strain on agriculture and resources. Droughts, crop failures, and population displacement disrupted food supplies. When combined with constant warfare, these pressures reduced the empire's resilience. Assyria could conquer vast lands, but sustaining them required stability it increasingly lacked. By the late 7th century BCE, the empire faced a convergence of threats. External rivals had grown stronger, learning Assyrian tactics and adapting them for their own. Internally, loyalty was brittle, held together only by fear. The system that once ensured dominance now demanded more energy than it could produce. The stage was set for a collapse that would shock the ancient world. The empire that had perfected the art of terror would soon discover its limits, as enemies it had brutalized for generations began to coordinate, resist, and strike back, not out of ambition alone, but out of accumulated hatred waiting for the moment when fear no longer outweighed hope. That moment came when Assyria's enemies realized that the empire's greatest strength had become its greatest weakness. The system was built on constant motion, constant intimidation, constant victory. The moment that rhythm faltered, the illusion of invincibility began to crack. And once fear started to fade, everything Assyria had suppressed for generations began to surface at once. One of the most dangerous problems Assyria faced was succession. Unlike later empires that developed clear rules for inheritance, Assyrian kingship often descended into violent competition. When a strong king died, rival claimants emerged almost immediately. Court factions, military commanders, and provincial governors chose sides, not out of loyalty, but survival. Civil war was not an exception, it was a recurring feature. Each internal struggle diverted armies away from the frontiers and signaled weakness to subject peoples watching closely. These moments of instability were exactly what long-oppressed regions had been waiting for. Babylonia in particular remained a constant source of trouble. Though repeatedly conquered, Babylon was never truly pacified. It possessed deep cultural prestige, ancient religious authority, and a population that refused to accept Assyrian domination as legitimate. Every Assyrian king knew that control of Babylon was symbolically essential, yet practically impossible to maintain without constant force. The Assyrian response to Babylonian rebellion reveals both their strength and their fatal rigidity. When revolts broke out, Assyrian armies responded with overwhelming brutality, destroying cities, deporting populations, and even desecrating temples. At one point, Babylon itself was razed, its sacred statues carried off as spoils. This act sent shockwaves across the ancient world. It was meant to demonstrate absolute dominance, but it achieved the opposite. It turned Babylon from a rebellious province into a symbol of resistance, uniting enemies who might otherwise have remained divided. While Assyria focused on suppressing internal revolts, new external powers were quietly gaining strength. The Medes to the east, once fragmented tribal groups, began to unite into a formidable force. They studied Assyrian tactics, adopted iron weaponry, and learned siege warfare by watching and surviving Assyrian campaigns. To the south, Babylonian leaders rebuilt alliances and waited patiently. These were not impulsive enemies. They understood that direct confrontation with Assyria at its peak was suicide. They waited for exhaustion. And exhaustion was unavoidable. The Assyrian military machine required enormous resources. Armies had to be fed, equipped, and moved across vast distances year after year. Deportation policies had disrupted agricultural regions, reducing long-term productivity. Skilled laborers were relocated, but not always efficiently. Fields were abandoned, trade routes were strained by constant war. The empire could still conquer, but sustaining control grew harder with every campaign. Psychologically, the constant emphasis on terror had another unintended effect. It eliminated the possibility of loyalty. Subject peoples did not identify with Assyria. They complied, but they never cooperated. When Assyrian authority weakened, there were no allies to rally in its defense. Governors defected, garrisons were isolated, cities that once surrendered without a fight now opened their gates to Assyria's enemies. Even within the Assyrian heartland, the cost of endless war became visible. Families lost generation after generation of men to campaigns that never ended. The glorification of violence sustained morale for a time, but fatigue accumulated. Soldiers were disciplined, but discipline cannot fully replace belief. As victories became harder and rebellions more frequent, the sense of divine favor that had justified everything began to waver. The reign of Ashurbanipal represents the peak and the turning point of Assyrian power. Militarily brilliant and culturally ambitious, he crushed enemies with precision while building vast libraries and palaces. His campaigns extended Assyrian dominance to its greatest territorial extent, yet his reign also marked the last moment when the empire functioned as intended. After his death, the carefully balanced system unraveled with alarming speed. Rival claimants fought over the throne. Provinces seized the opportunity to break away. Babylonia revolted once again, this time with broader support. The Medes advanced from the east, no longer raiders but organized armies. Assyria found itself fighting multiple large-scale wars simultaneously, something its system was never designed to handle. The empire excelled at crushing isolated resistance, not coordinated opposition. When Nineveh, the heart of Assyrian power, finally came under siege, the event carried immense symbolic weight. This was the city whose walls had displayed centuries of conquest and terror. Now those same walls faced enemies who had learned Assyria's own methods. The siege was relentless. Supply lines were cut, flooding weakened defenses, internal disorder compounded external pressure. When Nineveh fell, it was not just a military defeat, it was the psychological collapse of an idea. The destruction was total. Palaces burned, reliefs were shattered, libraries were buried beneath rubble. The city that had once terrified the ancient world was reduced to ruins so complete that later generations would doubt it had ever existed. Assyria's other cities fell soon after. There was no last stand, no dramatic recovery. The empire collapsed with astonishing speed once its core was broken. What followed was just as significant as the fall itself. The memory of Assyria became a warning etched into the consciousness of the ancient Near East. Later empires studied Assyrian methods closely, but they also learned from its failure. Fear could conquer, but it could not sustain unity. Violence could suppress rebellion, but it could not eliminate resentment. Control without legitimacy required endless force, and endless force inevitably led to exhaustion. Yet history ultimately delivered its verdict. An empire built entirely on fear creates enemies faster than it can destroy them. It leaves no space for compromise, no path to loyalty, no margin for weakness. When the moment of vulnerability arrives, everything collapses at once. The Assyrian Wars were not just a series of conquests, they were the first full expression of militarized empire, a blueprint that would be reused, modified, and resisted for thousands of years. And they remind us that the methods that build power fastest often plant the seeds of their destruction just as quickly. Even after the physical destruction of Assyria, its shadow continued to shape the ancient world in ways that were not immediately visible. The fall of Nineveh did not erase the systems Assyria had created. It exposed how deeply they had penetrated regional politics, warfare, and administration. Former subject peoples did not simply return to earlier ways of life. They inherited an environment permanently altered by centuries of militarized rule. The victors who replaced Assyria understood this better than anyone. The Neo-Babylonian Empire and the Medes did not dismantle Assyrian methods out of moral rejection. They selectively adopted them. Standing armies, provincial administration, intelligence gathering, and siege warfare were retained, though often with less overt brutality. Fear had proven effective, but Assyria had demonstrated the danger of relying on it alone. Successors sought balance, combining coercion with accommodation. This shift reveals something important about why Assyria ultimately failed. Its rulers believed that terror itself could substitute for legitimacy. They assumed that if fear was absolute, obedience would be permanent. But legitimacy is not just submission, it is acceptance of rule as unavoidable or even beneficial. Assyria never attempted to create that acceptance. It did not offer a shared identity or future. It offered only survival under domination. Religion, which had once unified Assyrian purpose, became another vulnerability. The claim that the gods demanded endless conquest worked as long as victories continued. When defeats began to accumulate, that same belief turned dangerous. If the gods favored Assyria, how could Assyria fall? The collapse shattered not only political authority, but spiritual certainty. For subjects and Assyrians alike, the fall suggested that divine support was conditional, not eternal. The psychological impact of Assyria's collapse was profound. Cities that had lived under its threat for generations suddenly experienced a vacuum of power. Old rivalries resurfaced, borders shifted rapidly. Violence did not disappear with Assyria, it fragmented. In some regions, chaos followed as no single power could immediately replace Assyrian dominance. The empire's brutality had suppressed conflict without resolving it. Once removed, unresolved tensions erupted. Assyria's military culture also left a lasting imprint on how war itself was understood. Before Assyria, warfare was often seasonal, limited, and ritualized. After Assyria, war increasingly became existential. Total destruction of enemy cities, mass deportation, and psychological terror entered the accepted repertoire of statecraft. Later empires would use these tools more selectively, but they never fully abandoned them. This raises an uncomfortable truth. Assyria was not an aberration. It was a prototype. It showed what happens when a state organizes itself entirely around war and fear. Many later powers would follow similar paths, convinced they could avoid Assyria's mistakes while retaining its advantages. Some succeeded for a time, none escaped the underlying dilemma forever. The Assyrian approach also reshaped leadership itself. Kings were no longer just administrators or judges, they were expected to be warriors above all else. Personal bravery, ruthlessness, and the ability to inspire fear became political qualifications. This militarization of leadership narrowed the range of acceptable rule. Peaceful governance became suspect. Diplomacy was tolerated only when backed by force. Inside Assyria, this mentality created a society permanently mobilized. Art glorified violence, education emphasized obedience, religion reinforced hierarchy. Even leisure spaces, such as palace courtyards, were decorated with scenes of conquest. Violence was not hidden from daily life, it was celebrated as order itself. For generations, Assyrians grew up believing that domination was not just necessary, but righteous. That worldview made reform almost impossible. Any attempt to soften rule risked being interpreted as weakness. Any reduction in military activity threatened the ideological foundation of the state. When conditions demanded adaptation, economic strain, demographic pressure, external coordination, Assyria lacked the flexibility to change course. Its identity was too tightly bound to conquest. The empire's collapse also challenges the assumption that advanced military systems guarantee long-term dominance. Assyria possessed superior weapons, organization, and experience. What it lacked was strategic restraint. Every success encouraged further expansion. Every rebellion demanded harsher punishment. Over time, the system consumed itself. The army became overstretched. The population thinned. The empire grew larger but less stable. There is also an important lesson in how Assyria was remembered. Unlike some fallen empires that inspired nostalgia, Assyria inspired relief. Its destruction was celebrated in texts and traditions across the region. Even centuries later, Assyria was remembered as a symbol of cruelty rather than greatness. This legacy mattered. Memory influences power. An empire that leaves behind only hatred leaves no allies to defend its memory or revive its influence. Yet modern archaeology complicates this picture. Excavations of Assyrian cities reveal administrative sophistication, legal systems, and cultural achievements often overshadowed by violence. Libraries, urban planning, and craftsmanship flourished alongside warfare. This contradiction forces a deeper question. Was Assyria inherently brutal, or did its environment and historical moment push it toward extreme solutions? The answer lies somewhere in between. Assyria existed in a competitive, violent region where survival required strength, but it chose to elevate fear into doctrine rather than tool. Other states faced similar pressures and chose differently. Assyria's uniqueness was not its violence, but its belief that violence alone could sustain an empire indefinitely. In this sense, the Assyrian Wars marked a turning point in human history. They represent the moment when war ceased to be merely a means to an end and became an organizing principle of civilization. The Assyrians did not just fight wars, they built a world around fighting them. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power itself. How much coercion can a system absorb before it collapses? Can order imposed by fear ever transform into stability? And how often do societies mistake dominance for security, only to discover too late that they have built something too rigid to survive change? As the ancient Near East moved forward without Assyria, these questions lingered beneath every new empire that rose, and those centuries have passed, the answers remain disturbingly relevant. As the echoes of Assyria's collapse spread across the ancient world, the consequences of their military dominance and culture of fear became painfully clear. The vacuum left behind by the empire's destruction was not a calm space, but a tempest of competing powers, ambitions, and identities. Neighboring states, long suppressed by Assyria's relentless campaigns, surged forward to claim territories and assert influence. Babylonia, which had endured repeated subjugation, finally emerged as a center of power, but its authority was contested by Medes, Elamites, and smaller kingdoms that had learned the hard lessons of survival under the Assyrian shadow. The region entered a period of fragmentation, yet the methods and legacies of Assyrian warfare continued to dictate strategy, diplomacy, and governance. The Assyrian military innovations had set new standards for warfare that resonated far beyond their collapse. Their use of combined arms, infantry, cavalry, chariots, archers, and siege engineers working in coordinated campaigns became a model for subsequent empires. Roads constructed for rapid troop movement allowed not only military logistics, but also the flow of information and resources, setting a precedent for administrative efficiency in expansive territories. Even their psychological warfare, once considered extreme, became integrated into the strategies of successor states. Leaders recognized that controlling the perception of power through terror or propaganda could achieve outcomes as significant as battlefield victories. Yet the systemic reliance on fear also demonstrated its inherent fragility. Assyria had overextended itself militarily, administratively, and psychologically. Its constant campaigns created fatigue among soldiers and unrest among subjugated populations. When the central authority weakened due to succession crises or the death of strong kings, the intricate balance of intimidation and control collapsed almost instantly. Provinces rebelled simultaneously, revealing that fear alone cannot create loyalty. This lesson echoed through history. Empires that govern solely by terror are inherently unstable, and their downfall can be sudden and catastrophic. Culturally, the Assyrian legacy was paradoxical. On one hand, they left behind horrific memories of brutality. On the other, they contributed to the intellectual and artistic development of Mesopotamia. The libraries of Ashurbanipal, for instance, preserved thousands of cuneiform texts covering literature, law, medicine, and administration. Urban planning and monumental architecture flourished, demonstrating that a society focused on war could also produce enduring cultural achievements. The contradiction is striking. The same rulers who impaled enemies also sponsored education and documentation, leaving a dual legacy of destruction and knowledge. Economically, the empire's practices created short-term wealth but long-term instability. Tribute from conquered territories enriched the central state, yet the depopulation and displacement of communities undermined sustainable agriculture and local economies. Cities that were flattened or forcibly relocated contributed to a cycle of instability. When the empire fell, much of the economic infrastructure it had built either collapsed or was repurposed by emerging powers, revealing how fragile economies based primarily on conquest and coercion can be. The human cost of the Assyrian Wars cannot be overstated. Millions were killed, enslaved, or deported. Populations were uprooted from ancestral lands, eroding local identities and social cohesion. The trauma endured by these communities influenced social and political structures long after the empire vanished. Oral traditions, myths, and local histories preserved memory of Assyrian atrocities, embedding a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked militarism. Even today, archaeologists and historians confront evidence of mass killings and forced relocations that continue to inspire awe and horror. Strategically, the Assyrian experience offers timeless lessons. The empire's expansion was predicated on a relentless, almost obsessive drive for territorial control and political dominance. Yet the same strategies that produced short-term victories sowed the seeds of long-term vulnerability. Assyria demonstrates that central authority dependent on terror and continuous war is unsustainable. A balance between coercion, legitimacy, and local integration is crucial to maintaining lasting control. Modern military theorists often cite Assyria when discussing the limits of brute force, logistical overreach, and the psychological dimensions of warfare. Politically, the empire reshaped the way leaders thought about power and governance. Kings were expected to embody martial excellence, project fear, and enforce obedience across vast distances. Administrative systems evolved to monitor governors and ensure compliance, foreshadowing centralized bureaucracies in later empires. Yet the very sophistication that enabled control also introduced rigidity. When faced with unprecedented challenges or coordinated uprisings, the system lacked the flexibility to adapt, highlighting an enduring tension between centralization and resilience in empire building. Assyria's influence also extended to neighboring cultures and empires. Babylonian, Persian, and later Hellenistic powers absorbed lessons from Assyria's campaigns, both in tactics and statecraft. The notion that terror could be weaponized was not lost, though later civilizations tempered it with administrative sophistication and cultural diplomacy. Even Rome, centuries later, would encounter the same strategic dilemmas, balancing military dominance with sustainable governance, legitimacy, and the management of diverse populations. In reflecting on the Assyrian Wars, one sees the duality of human ambition. Assyria was capable of extraordinary organization, innovation, and cultural achievement, yet it was equally capable of unimaginable cruelty and short-sightedness. The empire's rise and fall underscore the paradox of militarized states. Immense power can be achieved through fear and brutality, but such power is inherently vulnerable, and longevity requires more than intimidation. It requires integration, legitimacy, and adaptability. Ultimately, the Assyrian Wars teach us that empire is as much a psychological endeavor as a physical one. The creation of fear can win battles, but it cannot secure loyalty or enduring stability. The Assyrians' unmatched ability to terrify did not prevent their collapse. It accelerated it by generating unrelenting hatred, rebellion, and resistance. Their story is a testament to both the ingenuity and the hubris of a civilization that sought to dominate not just the land, but the minds of all it conquered. The rise and fall of Assyria offers profound lessons for understanding power, governance, and human behavior. How much can terror and coercion sustain an empire before they provoke the very collapse they were designed to prevent? Can innovation in military strategy and administration compensate for the absence of legitimacy and loyalty? And in the end, what is the true cost of ruling through fear, both for the ruler and the ruled? Do you think the Assyrian model of dominance was inevitable given its environment, or could the empire have survived if it had tempered fear with integration and legitimacy?